Welcome to the first episode of ESG in the Arctic, the fall 2021 edition of the Breaking the Ice podcast. My name is Lisa.
And I'm Connor, and we are your co-hosts. Over the next few weeks, we'll be discussing the potential impacts that ESG investing may have on those living in the Arctic. We'll be speaking to people with a variety of backgrounds to investigate the question, what kind of role, if any, will ESG have in encouraging or discouraging the much-needed investment in the Arctic?
Today, we'll explore the 2019 Arctic Corporate Shipping Pledge, created by Ocean Conservancy in collaboration with Nike. With the Arctic warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world, the melting ice in the Arctic is opening up new pathways for transshipment routes. According to Ocean Conservancy, this increase in shipping poses threats to the marine ecosystems and to the people who live in the Arctic communities. The pledge has been signed by several corporations, including H&M Group, Li & Fung, Hapag-Lloyd, and the Mediterranean Shipping Company.
Joining us today is Whit Sheard, the Senior Director of Shipping Emissions at Ocean Conservancy, as well as the lead for Ocean Conservancy's International Arctic Program. Together, we will discuss the aims and origins of the pledge, Ocean Conservancy's collaboration with Nike, and the possible implications of the pledge, especially in relation to the impacts of the communities living in the Arctic. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Shadian. I'm the president and CEO for Arctic 360. We're Canada's only Arctic-focused think tank. And today we have a really great conversation ahead of us. We have our 2 co-hosts here. We have Lisa Toy and Connor Oak, 2 of our fellows at Arctic 360. And we have a new stream. So we have a podcast series called Breaking the Ice. Over the summer, we did one on innovation in the Arctic and a second one on Greenland, Canada, Northern relations. And so now we're kicking off, thank you, Whit, we're kicking off a new one on ESG in the Arctic. And so today, our conversation, really fortunate to have Whit Sheard here from the Ocean Conservancy. But you could tell us a little bit more about yourself as I pass off the baton. Lisa, I'll let you take it away and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. So thank you again, Whit, for joining us today. So would you be able to tell us a little about yourself and how you got here?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. I grew up on the Great Lakes when I was younger, so I spent a lot of time both in relatively cold climates and large bodies of water. After school, I moved out west and ended up in Palmer, Alaska, where I began working on conservation issues, largely related to the marine environment. Throughout the last 20 years, I've had the good fortune to work on issues such as Arctic offshore drilling, fisheries in the Arctic, and then work at the Arctic Council, where I began working on international shipping and Arctic shipping issues, largely what I work on now.
Great. Thank you so much. And in sort of the similar vein, would you be able to tell us about the Ocean Conservancy's International Arctic Program?
Sure. The Ocean Conservancy's International Arctic Program is relatively young. It's something we started because I have a board membership with the Circumpolar Conservation Union, which is an accredited observer at the Arctic Council, where, as you know, Arctic policy is discussed and sometimes formulated, and it's a really good opportunity for a conservation organization like myself to observe the discussions. And I've always really appreciated the Arctic Council because the countries bring the indigenous communities of the North to the table in the conversation. So it's a place where I've been able to listen and learn quite a bit about economies of the North and the cultures of the North. So I feel very fortunate in that the work has been supported and we've been able to collaborate on issues of importance in Arctic communities.
Thank you very much. So the main goal of our podcast in the fall session is to look into ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals and how those can be used in business or finance or infrastructure building to improve life in the Arctic and how these goals impact the Arctic. So you've gone forward on something called the Arctic Pledge. So we're hoping you could tell us a little bit about what the Arctic Pledge is, what are the origins of it, what are the aims of it?
Sure, thanks, Connor. The origins of the Arctic Pledge come from work done by the Arctic Council on the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment and work that was being undertaken at the International Maritime Organization to reform the Polar Code, which applies to Antarctica and the Arctic Ocean. Basically, the Arctic Council identified the largest threat to the marine environment in the Arctic and communities that rely on it as a heavy fuel oil spill from a large cargo ship. Similarly, at the International Maritime Organization, there was work being undertaken, including all stakeholders and community groups from the Arctic, to extend the ban on heavy fuel oil use, which was banned in the Arctic or in the Antarctic, into the Arctic Ocean as well. This was something that was really important to a variety of stakeholders, and something that was really driven home to many people back in 2004 when the Selendang IU cargo ship broke up in the Aleutian Islands and dumped about 1.3 million liters of heavy fuel oil, which is sort of the dirtiest and most toxic and most persistent type of bunker fuel used. It's basically roofing tar. It's the bottom of the barrel and one of the cheapest things you can use, which is why it's always been used for cargo. But it threatened the community's livelihoods. It shut down local fishing and crabbing and almost shut down the processing in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, which is the about half of the seafood in the United States is caught there. So there was a long process, a stakeholder process to discuss this and remediation issues, and it really helped spur the work at the Arctic Council and the International Maritime Organization to start address these issues as related to transshipment across in this case, the Pacific Ocean hitting the southern Arctic. But it really spurred a conversation about the Arctic Ocean and the dialogue that some companies were having about how they could take a shortcut across the Arctic Ocean. And although there were some fuel savings that were positive, the studies that were happening and the dialogue that was happening really pointed to the fact that it's much riskier up there. There's no response efforts that could be mounted. Even in Alaska and in the Alaskan Arctic, the nearest Coast Guard stations, 1,000, 1,500 kilometers away. So the dialogue was around the level of risk that was occurring or would occur if we opened up a new route in the Arctic. And it seemed that a large number of stakeholders felt that this was a premature item to do. Paired with the global conversation about climate change and the decrease in sea ice and the fact that the Arctic is warming so much faster, we came to the conclusion, shared by many, that the risks were already too high, and that as there were no localized benefits to transshipment across the ocean in these large ships, that this was something we could take a position on relatively comfortably to raise the level of dialogue around protection of the Arctic Ocean and this unacceptable level of risk to communities in the north.
Okay, so just to boil it down to a single point, organizations that sign on to this pledge are pledging not to use a trans-Arctic shipment route, essentially.
Yes, and it of course explicitly makes clear that local and regional shipping, which is the livelihood of many remote Arctic communities, is not included whatsoever, that this is just ships that would be passing by that have been identified as the largest risk to the marine environment up there.
Right, okay. So looking at the list of people who have signed on, one of the partners of the pledge is Nike. So how did this collaboration come about?
Yeah, as you know, Nike has been pretty active on some social justice issues. I think, like a lot of companies, of course, they have been criticized for, woke capitalism, as some people call it, or making statements that might just pad their bottom line. But this was something where our conversations really, to me at least, indicated that they were being thoughtful about the Arctic Ocean. And this was at a time a couple of years ago when French President Macron, for example, was talking about how the opening of the Arctic sea ice and potential transportation across the sea was actually not a positive development. It was, in fact, a tragedy that was occurring, the loss of sea ice habitat so important to so many species. And it wasn't something to take advantage of. It was something to redouble our efforts and focus on. I am under, non-disclosure agreements about the specific conversation with these companies. So I do need to make it clear I only speak about my thoughts and my experience. But I really felt like these companies were coming to the table with a belief that they weren't quite sure what they could do for the Arctic and for the larger issue of climate change, besides some pledges they had made on greenhouse gas emissions. So we did try to work with them to develop something that would spur the dialogue around protections for the Arctic. But you'll also see in the pledge, there's a couple points we make about recognizing that greenhouse gas emissions from all shipping is an issue that these companies need to address. And then we tried to make sure that it couldn't be interpreted as, well, we're not going to ship across the Arctic anyway, so we can make this statement, this sort of virtue signaling you see today that, would have no impact on the bottom lines. And we worked very hard as a team to also recognize the larger issues related to global shipping and global movement of goods. And you can see that we have included statements about precautionary management needed before any shipping does happen if we move down that route, and that these companies recognize that they're part of the larger problem that is driving warming in the Arctic. So again, I really felt like the participation was above board and that they were trying to help us make a difference. The other important thing to note is the companies the cargo companies that signed up, they represent up to a third of all cargo shipping that goes across the ocean, the carriers themselves. So this was not just retail companies, in my opinion, virtue signaling. It was also members of the industry and a significant portion of the industry coming together and say, we agree, and we need to have this larger dialogue, and we need to make this statement because a shorter route across the Arctic comes with too many negatives, and the real issues that need to be addressed are the smokestack emissions from shipping and the disproportionate risk to these communities of the North from a potential new route.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious. So in Ocean Conservancy's work as a whole, is it common to work with large corporate partners like Nike, or is this sort of a unique case?
It's situationally dependent. I mean, when we find good actors that want to collaborate, we will certainly move in that direction. Something that was just launched that we were a part of a couple weeks ago is the Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels initiative. That is a partnership with the Aspen Institute. And that is actually some large companies similarly getting together, in this case, Amazon, Patagonia, and others, and saying, we need to figure out a way to aggregate our demand and get zero emission vessels moving cargo across the planet sooner than later. So they committed to getting this done by 2030 and fully decarbonizing their transport and pushing for the industry to do the same. Sorry, they want to get the first boat on the water in 2030, fully decarbonize their transport by 2040, and then have the entire shipping industry, which is 3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, fully decarbonized by 2050, which I think is a very appropriate goal and really was built on being in alignment with a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit that we're learning from the United Nations process, and all of the climate assessments are something we need to stay under to avoid catastrophic response. So it's potentially something that we'll be doing more of when we find partners that we consider are not just making statements, but also taking actions that can lead industry. And I think that's a really good example right there of, we moved from the statement on Arctic shipping. We noted that greenhouse gas emissions across the board needed to be dealt with. And now we're seeing an initiative from companies that are committed to action and taking the next steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their industry, which I think is a positive. And if this keeps happening, I'm more than happy to work with industries, because we are more of a classic conservation organization that has worked with governments and to a lesser extent communities, but to try to get initiatives that actually make a difference and that regulations result from. And so we are largely in the business of attempting to regulate industry. So, as you noted, it's a movement in a new direction a little bit, but one that I think we have thought carefully about, and we're trying to do in a manner that incorporates feedback and includes, more partners than just companies and conservation groups.
Interesting. Thank you so much. We talked about this a little beforehand, but in terms of the process of the pledge itself, going back to the pledge itself, would you be able to tell us a bit more in detail about the specific sort of process that Ocean Conservancy followed to develop it?
Sure. We had a lot of internal and external dialogue about the appropriate way for this to go forward. And, largely what we did was we sat down and we listed out what would be our priorities and what would be acceptable to us as, not coming across as greenwashing or just virtue signaling, but something that would really make a difference. Then the companies we were working with, we took a look at their corporate social responsibility initiatives. We talked to them about their supply chain. And really what we were looking for in many ways was companies that could ship goods across the Arctic, but chose not to specifically, so that it wouldn't just be a situation of someone foregoing something that they weren't going to do anyway and trying to force their opinions on others. So, those were key elements, looking for companies that could take advantage of this route, but would be willing to make a statement that it wasn't appropriate at this time. And also companies generally that had a commitment to social responsibility that, hopefully was more than just to the environment.
Thank you. In terms of the process for consent, in terms of the communities that live in these regions, what was the Ocean Conservancy's process for free informed prior consent?
Right. As we were working on just Arctic trans-shipments and large companies, we did not have a specific process for prior informed consent, something we completely support, as well as sovereignty for these communities in the North. And in fact, this goes back to the work at the Arctic Council, where if you don't explicitly recognize these things, you're not in the room and able to participate in these conversations. So as opposed to a specific process, what we did was we built on the 10 years we had worked in the shipping experts group at the Arctic Council, where you have the Inuit, where you have the Aleuts, where you have all members of northern communities, and made sure that everything that we'd learned from those communities was included in this. And that's why we took the time in this process to make sure that local and regional shipping in the Arctic was noted as incredibly important to these communities, and something that this was not in any way intended to impact, except for potentially positively in terms of looking at precautionary management in the Arctic Ocean. But I think you can see it's just one page, the Arctic Pledge. I encourage everyone to read it, but right at the very top of that, it acknowledges the importance of local shipping to communities. And so this was about transshipment by large companies that had been identified through the Arctic Council process as posing the largest threat to the marine environment and to the subsistence way of life of these communities, without providing any localized benefit. If in any way this was going to touch on communities and livelihoods, it would have been a much longer process and would have included much larger dialogue, something quite frankly that doesn't often happen when companies are making these statements. So we did our best to explicitly address this. I had lots of hallway conversations with folks we work with in communities up north at the Arctic Council and otherwise, to make sure that we were doing this in the best way possible. And while we're always welcome to continuing feedback on doing it better, I think we did a pretty good job of making sure that the decade or more that we've worked on these issues with the communities of the North, the lessons learned were reflected right up front in the first paragraph of this pledge.
Right. Just to build on what you're saying here, and speaking a little bit more generally, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can balance having infrastructure and economic potential for the people who live in the North with, as you've highlighted, the need to have a safe and clean environment. How do those two factors get balanced?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, and although it's one I'm happy to comment on from my perspective as someone from a conservation organization who's worked in the North but is not a member of a community or from an indigenous community. From my perspective, the Arctic Council is a very good example of how to start getting it done. There's a sustainable development working group that specifically focuses on the issue of economic development and environmental protection It is largely agenda driven by the community organizations of the North where these things are discussed. So I think the first step is, one, recognizing that it's different in the North and these communities have been excluded from these conversations. I think climate change is the perfect example where communities of the North are bearing the brunt of the initial impacts as the Arctic warms 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. But these communities are not the source of the carbon and pollution that is driving this change. And, we've seen efforts to make sure that Indigenous voices are included in the dialogue and Arctic Indigenous voices are included in the dialogue. But my opinion is that they have not been robust enough efforts, and that we need to restart these dialogues from an understanding of the history of these communities, the often paradoxical contradictions that can occur in these communities, but really in understanding that these are sovereign communities that have a much longer history and tradition within the region, and that the dialogue needs to start there. It doesn't need to start at think tanks. It doesn't need to necessarily start at conservation organizations. It needs to start with and in the communities, and they need to be empowered to be able to take take advantage of things like prior informed consent, which I do not believe has been, implemented in almost any of the Arctic countries, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm wondering, there is this critical lack of infrastructure in the North. There's a lack of marine infrastructure. There's a lack of pretty much everything. And financial institutions do have a very important role in building this critical infrastructure. So one thing I am wondering is, if we do prohibit shipping through the Arctic, do you worry about that detracting from financial institutions making other kinds of investments in the Arctic that are needed?
I do, and that's why we tried to make it very clear that this was relatively divorced from the economies of the local communities. I get very concerned when financial institutions make broad statements about not investing in the Arctic, investing in renewable energy, investing in communities, investing in language preservation programs. These are all incredibly important things that need to happen in the North. These companies might be trying to make statements, that we're not going to invest in heavily polluting industries and carbon intensive industries. But in my opinion, they need to make statements about the just transition to a newer, cleaner economy that includes northern communities and that includes understanding what can be, a pretty complex conversation with communities of the North that need to include commitments to education, healthcare, things like broadband infrastructure, and that aren't just necessarily the traditional economic dialogue of do we want a factory or not, but really that wrap into these other larger issues around maintaining the subsistence way of life, recognizing sovereignty, and being sure that these decisions made on the global stage are informed by communities and are in fact in, many ways in service to the needs and stated wishes of these community members.
Thank you.
Thank you. And, going back to the sort of emissions of global maritime shipping, you've already touched on this a little bit, but we know that approximately 3% of global emissions come from the global maritime shipping. So that would include, for example, the Suez and Panama canals. And so given this, why has the Ocean Conservancy chosen to focus on the Arctic shipping routes, which have very little transshipment taking place? Was this focus more so on the possibility of oil spills?
Yes, absolutely. At the time, we were working both on finalizing the regulations under the Polar Code at the International Maritime Organization to phase out the use of the dirtiest fuel, heavy fuel oil in the North. And we were working with several community members that this was very important to. So we were building this work both from our International Arctic Program and from the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment from the Arctic Council, which highlighted this as most important. As I mentioned earlier, I think you hit the nail on the head. And as the second paragraph of the pledge says, it's really global greenhouse gas emissions that are the existing problem. And these companies that sign this are part of that problem, and they recognize it and want to turn the corner. So, in my mind, it was a moment in time a couple of years ago when this was something that people wanted to talk about, and we were engaged in working on regulations for the Arctic based on the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment and the input of the Arctic communities. And I think what we've tried to do with that second paragraph and our work since then is build a movement around decarbonizing the shipping industry. And so again, we just launched with the Aspen Institute that Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels process. And just from an internal working perspective, Ocean Conservancy spends far more time working on global greenhouse gas emission reduction from shipping than we do specifically on Arctic management measures, because this is a very real existing problem. And it's been fantastic because we've been working with some of the small island developing states, for example, in the Pacific, places like Tuvalu, Trinidad and Tobago, the Royal Marshall Islands. And even only after a year of this work, they've made clear several things to us. One is that they are sovereign indigenous states, and they are very proud of that. The second is because they face this similar existential crisis to their islands disappearing and their culture in many ways being wiped out by the impacts of climate change, something similar to what we hear in the north from communities that need to be relocated or are losing subsistence resources. They've reached out and asked, can they form partnerships with communities in the Arctic to really drive home what the impacts of the existing greenhouse gas emissions are from shipping and the urgency of the issue. And in my mind, this is something that we as conservation groups and as these companies can do, is empower that dialogue and let these communities and states take the lead and in many ways direct us to where we need to move. And I hope that's reflected in the Arctic Shipping Pledge, for example, which was, again, cognizant of the importance of local shipping and specific that this needed to continue. And then also, fed into the dialogue about really the issue is your existing shipping companies. Are you willing to recognize that? And are you willing to start working on it? So I hope that we've made that pivot and we're investing the proper amount of time on global greenhouse gas emissions without losing the commitment to ensuring that if asked, we are able to continue to be allies with communities of the North on these issues that can really impact subsistence resources, especially.
So building on something you said earlier in the interview as well, you mentioned earlier on that by 2030, there will be actually a lot of 0% emissions in shipping happening. And one company that's done this is Maersk. So do you think that if we have 0% emission shipping by 2030, around the time when we might start seeing large scale shipping through the Arctic, does it take away from the pledge that we might not be seeing many shipments to the Arctic regardless before we hit 0% emissions?
Right. It would be great if it could take away from the pledge, because that would mean there is reduced risk in the marine environment. I think it's important. It would be important to talk to communities specifically about that, because there are still going to be impacts from ships. Noise from ships, for example, is enormous. And in the Arctic, it's larger than in other places because of the ice, and it impacts subsistence resources, which, if driven even a kilometer or two off of their traditional routes, can cause quite a disruption to the subsistence way of life in these communities. So I think it would be a very positive development. I do not think it would solve all of the problems that we're looking at in the Arctic, but of course, removing that major risk from heavy fuel oil and oil spills is a great first step. And I would, of course, defer to the communities on whether or not the level of risk that remains is worth it, considering we haven't really identified any local benefits from basically flyover boats that are just passing by and, not stopping, not part of the economies of the communities whatsoever. So I think some risk would remain, but of course it would be fantastic to eliminate that first identified risk from the Arctic Council's Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment.
I think that's a great point.
Shifting the focus onto ESG, Do you think it has the potential to play an important role in safeguarding the Arctic?
I do. I'm highly skeptical. I've always been highly skeptical because I worry about sort of flavor of the month campaigns and, virtue signaling, greenwashing, the idea of, false woke capitalism and things like that. But it's something we have to address, and it's something that we can do better. You can see companies like Patagonia and others who are trying to move to zero waste and zero emissions as fast as possible. I personally would like to see more companies spending more time in dialogue with communities of the North, and not just reaching out and asking these communities to give them advice, but actually resourcing these communities and some of the nonprofit organizations in these communities to ensure that they can be at the table, and that it's not just causing more stress on the limited time that communities have to work on these issues. So I think the history of ESG is been positive and negative in many ways. So I'm hopeful that the positive can be accentuated, and that these real commitments, not just statements of ambition, but actually timelines, pathways to action, interim steps, and resourcing under-resourced partners like some of the communities of the North to be at the table and to be better able to participate in what hopefully can be a more green economy. This is what I referenced earlier about the conversation around a just transition. I don't think companies can just say, we'll reduce our emissions and we've done the right thing. I think there is a social aspect to it in resourcing communities that have been left out of the conversation sometimes, and who have, had major decisions made on their behalf without prior informed consent or even legitimate input in so many ways. So I think there's a long way to go for ESG, but it's something that needs to happen. And in many ways, it's why I was willing to take this leap into working on the pledge and then working on the cargo owners for zero emission vessels as well. I think we have an opportunity to make it better. And I think we have an opportunity not to speak for these communities that have been cut out of the equation, but to constantly say, if you're not talking with these communities, if your decisions are not informed with these communities, we can't partner with you anymore. We can't be the only ones you bring to the table because, we're largely conservation organizations funded, by charitable trusts in the United States, at least. And, that doesn't represent the shared history of these communities in so many ways.
Great, thank you so much. I think you bring up such a great point about sort of risk of virtue signaling, which is definitely an issue that is possible for ESG, and we hope that will kind of be the positives will outweigh the negatives in that respect. And so, in that kind of similar vein, do you think that the Ocean Conservancy then has an important role to play in ESG?
I hope so. I hope we can. Obviously, our goals are largely based around conservation, but in the dialogue around a just transition and addressing the climate crisis, we've tried to spend a lot of time understanding how we can be an ally or even an accomplice across other social justice movements, and how we can help impact the larger social movements that arguably need to happen to get us to a sustainable economy. And dialogue with large corporations who have so much sway over where we're going in the future. We hope that we can be a positive part of that, and that it doesn't come at the expense of either us being able to work towards conservation or from these companies reaching out to the communities who they really need to invest much more time and resources into, in my opinion.
Great, thank you.
I think I might jump in to ask a question, but I also wanted to pick up on a few things that you had mentioned. You brought up a lot of important points, from things such as the just transition, potential with noise, and also, so I want to come back from it. Is one thing that you had mentioned that I think it was at the time, kind of when you were discussing with Nike about the pledge. I do remember the pledge came out around a time where there was also other pledges, strategic kind of declarations that came out that seemed to all be focused on the Arctic. So this time, I would say the ESG conversation was really about the E and less about the S and the G. And so we have financial institutions, making pledges, but the pledges were more about, they're not going to do any financial investments in hydrocarbons in the Arctic. That doesn't say anything about the investments they have ongoing or will do in the future anywhere else. And so speaking a little bit to the virtual signaling, and also the point you brought up, the importance of free informed prior consent. And so a lot of those pledges also demand that for future investments, but it's hard to just know what that conversation was amongst themselves internally with the indigenous communities, for instance. And so these pledges and these they came out, in around this, era in the, over let's say the course of a year or two, all focused on climate change, environment. And I'm just wondering if it also created the sense that fed into a lot of perceptions that we should keep the Arctic, locked up in a snow globe. And the best way to protect the people there is to do nothing, right? Never, we don't have any kind of things happening there, but we do know people live there. And we do know that people really need critical infrastructure. I mean, everything, like you said, about broadband, but then also running water. And some of this critical infrastructure actually supports safe shipping. So it's kind of a twofold question. I'm wondering first, so COVID created a kind of a turning stage, I would say, like a turning point with the whole ESG conversation. And we started to highlight, the people part of the ESG and the social issues. And I'm just wondering what you think, and if, maybe there's a possibility for, I don't know, like a part two, or, in these kind of pledges that also can have just as much focus on the people as the environment, because this sustainable development goes hand in hand. And so maybe if you could just comment a little bit maybe on the social part you see like in roles Ocean Conservancy might play in the S for ESG.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And again, I was also very concerned. It was a flavor of the month sort of thing that was happening at the time. And this perception of locking up the Arctic in a snow globe is one that concerns me, very greatly. Obviously, there's cultures that exist in the Arctic and have existed since time immemorial that are completely ignored and done a disservice by some of these statements. And again, I'll say that's why the very first paragraph of this attempted to recognize that there are social components of it that weren't being addressed. For Ocean Conservancy as a conservation organization, I think like a lot of conservation organizations in the past, people wanted to focus only on environmental issues, stay in our lane, that's what we do. And then, the realization comes that these things don't exist in a vacuum. There's an E and an S, in ESG, for example. I think that's a longer dialogue within the conservation community, but that hopefully the role we can play is as an ally, or as I said before, as an accomplice, as the case may be. And that really gets back to investing in and empowering communities. In many ways, we are not going to invest in the Arctic is a slap in the face to these ancient in many ways, but also very modern communities that exist in the North, and is a big concern. I think what we're trying to do is not necessarily work through the governance route on that, except to, as we have a small ESG component of our work, make sure that we're saying over and over again to these partners, these companies, that if they're not partnering and listening to and investing in communities of the North, this can't go any further. They're impacted, and these statements can be read by others inappropriately, in my opinion, to suggest we shouldn't be focused on working with these communities or allowing both prior informed consent and sovereignty as to the economic decisions being made in the North. So it's a difficult role for conservation organizations. It's one that we do not take lightly, but it's one that I certainly don't think that we can sit down with companies and figure out. If there was appropriate partners at the table, we'd be happy to engage in that dialogue. I think we're more at a moment in time with some of these companies just explaining that they have an obligation and a responsibility, both not to cause unintended consequences to these economies that have faced challenges based on remoteness, based on just the fact that the larger community often discriminates against them in so many ways, whether it's education funding or healthcare, that these companies have an obligation and a role to play in this. And it's not it's not within our role to tell them exactly what it is, but it is 100% within our role to make sure that they know these partnerships are not going to go forward if that dialogue isn't inclusive. And in fact, that they and we in the past have failed on this, and it needs to be a top line item that is addressed in any of these conversations.
Maybe I just have a follow-up. I guess another way of putting it is, do you think there could be like an ironic, in a way, benefit if there was to be increased shipping? First of all, I want to say with the caveat, like we are moving towards zero emission shipping. So we're going that direction. And so I know you were saying that Nike, was looking at, the possibility. So it wasn't just people who are never going to ship through the Arctic. But in reality, if they were going to start shipping through the Arctic, changing your whole logistics supply chain is not something that happens overnight. So it would have been more of a, medium term shift in and of itself. And so we are going towards more zero emissions. I know that, Alaska has done some really fantastic work on safe passages and creating safe passage lanes, like around the Great Circle Route and this type of thing. I know in Canada that there's a whole project as well that's been ongoing through the federal government to create also safe passageways through there. One of the things, if you talk to many communities in the North, they will say outright is that, they want more, maritime infrastructure. So, ports and obviously ports have then provide greater possibility to emergency preparedness and response, but also to help with interregional shipping. But let's say then if then there's an increase of just transshipments, one could say that would galvanize possibly the potential for more resources towards emergency preparedness and response infrastructure. So, ports and greater Coast Guard. And so, ships that can respond to an emergency. And so I'm wondering if what you feel then about safe passages, and if that is, something that you see potential to actually really work. And at some point, could there be, where's the between the risks, the payoff, and the benefits and the negative consequences in terms of if it could galvanize and help build some of the needed infrastructure on the maritime space?
Yeah, I actually don't see a causal effect there with transshipment, and we've looked at these things. There needs to be more investment in emergency response and preparedness, and in local ports, regardless of large ships passing by. I think the dialogue could be possibly increased and point to the need for these things, but they already exist without increased traffic. So, in many ways, planes that are flying from New York to San Francisco are not providing any benefit in Iowa, and building up the New York and San Francisco airports is probably not going to spur any investment in the airports in Iowa, unfortunately. So I think the conversation needs to be coupled a little bit. All of these are incredible needs for the region regardless. And really, we recognize even in the pledge that it might, transshipping might come to the Arctic. And that's why we talk about the need for precautionary management. The examples you brought up are good ones, because the routing measures in Alaska came largely from the Selendang IU disaster, that 1.3 million liters of heavy fuel oil that was dumped into fishing and local fishing grounds and fish processing grounds. Whereas my understanding of the work in Canada on protected areas in Iqaluit especially, and others, is that there have been some incredibly good work done on indigenous-led conservation areas. and that it's not necessarily a new paradigm, but I would say it's very different than what we saw in Alaska. And it's what I consider a very positive development in starting that dialogue with Indigenous-led conversations and with everybody at the table together, working these things out. So I can see if there's going to be an increase in transshipment, if we can incorporate that sort of new paradigm of making sure, unfortunately new, of making sure that it's Indigenous led and that the conversation comes from the communities and with the communities. I don't think there is right now any trickle down benefits to transshipment. It's still noted as the largest potential threat to the marine ecosystem of the Arctic and subsistence resources. So I really want to underscore that point. That has not changed. But anyway, to get this dialogue increased and to focus more attention on the need for prevention and port improvements and reception facilities, I think is incredibly useful. I worry that there are some disingenuous actors, from industries and government members, for example, pushing the Northern Sea route in Russia, that want to use that dialogue to open up Arctic Trans-Shipment without adequate precautions and safeguards, again, leaving all the identified risk on communities, but sort of using the communities as a straw man argument. Oh, there'll be trickle down benefits to these boats that pass by, only causing risk to these communities. We have seen no evidence of that whatsoever. And, the moment there is true evidence of that, I would be happy to incorporate that into the dialogue and the conversation. But really, I think those are two very separate conversations. All those needs exist right now. And transshipment is just a large risk with no local economic benefits at the moment.
I'll ask one final question and I'll open it up to all of you to add any more pieces or questions or thoughts you might have. There has been a lot of discussion. So I see what you're saying precisely. And my question originally was going to be, do you see like an opportunity for the U.S. and Canada to collaborate, cooperate in this whole region on safe shipping? There has been a concerted effort and discussion about trying to turn this whole region into some sort of regulated seaway, something akin a bit to the St. Lawrence Seaway idea. And so then there would be a way to, which is what Russia actually does though, is to tax people. So you basically charge people who want to do transshipments. And so like there could be a tax if you wanted to fly over Arctic. So it's creating a fee, and the fee for going through, and that fee could then help support just doing a lot of the helping to build a lot of the maritime infrastructure that we all know is needed and is wanted and is already a discussion, but no one seems to be willing to or has the resources to put all that money into it. So and I know Lisa Murkowski has also put, I think, a bill on the table that kind of speaks to the beginning of those type of conversations about trying to charge a fee and set something up that's a little bit more regulatory. I'm curious at your thoughts on this, and if this could, if there's anything here that might be of a benefit.
Yeah, I think that could be one component of a multitude of things that would have to happen. Unfortunately, without adequate response, without adequate port reception facilities, what you're doing is being reactionary and saying boats are going through, let's tax them and build these things up. That really doesn't mitigate this risk to the Arctic marine environment or these communities. But I think it's an important component of the dialogue, which again, I think should be community led. And that, routing measures, different technologies for engines, a carbon tax potentially, all of these things are important components, but I think they need to be in place before the ship. They need to be in place to mitigate the risk appropriately before shipping. And that's just, my personal opinion, but I think those investments need to be made before this identified number one risk to the environment is increased in place. And that's my view from my conservation seat, and I'm sure there's more nuanced and complicated views in some of these communities that are struggling with what we talked about in the very beginning, balancing environmental protection with sustainable development, especially in smaller remote economies.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you want to add, or does anyone have a follow-up question just before we wrap ourselves up?
Just, is there anything that you feel that you want to add to the conversation that we haven't been able to bring up so far?
I just think, I hope that you get the time to talk to various community members from Alaska or, from Canada to discuss the issue. It's obviously very complicated up there. You even have issues, the oil and gas industry and development in the US Arctic, the taxation from that has been used for, one of the strongest indigenous-led language preservation and dance preservation programs and keeping components of Inuit culture alive. Others in the community feel that it's the existential threat to their livelihood, that climate change will, render the traditional ways obsolete or subsistence resources unavailable. And you have this sort of very paradoxical and complicated situation where economic development can, of course, feed cultural stability and keep these communities' livelihoods and traditions alive, but also be part of what's threatening the availability of resources. So sometimes it seems easy to just talk about the conservation components of things because we're talking about protecting the marine environment, and this can help protect subsistence resources, but these are much more complicated issues. And when you get into the communities and start to talk to folks, you realize, and I hope these companies realize, it's much more complicated than that. And it really needs to get out of our traditional mode of, regulating from above and from economic decisions by large actors being what determines what goes on day to day in these places. So, in many ways, we have a myopic view in conservation, and we did our best to incorporate what we've learned from our community partners and from our work at the Arctic Council. But, to me, it's just the tip of the rapidly melting iceberg at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. And I think that's great. And actually, maybe I will send you a copy. We've, for 2 years with the Coast Guard, Arctic 360 has held a small shipping workshop with northern communities just to talk about safe, reliable shipping, what we need to do to get there. It hasn't been about transshipment, but there's, the overwhelming agreement among all, and you can see from a lot of the indigenous reports that have come out, is they all just want more infrastructure in the North writ large, critical infrastructure, but also maritime infrastructure to support shipping, support fishing among, and also increase supply, barges that can come through and these type of things. So how we get there is another question. So.
Yeah, the critical infrastructure investments, need to come from everybody, including these companies. And, this movement, hopefully towards indigenous-led conservation and a little more thoughtful outreach by governments and conservation groups and others that are pushing for conservation. I think these are movements in the right direction, and hopefully we'll see that in, ESG as well. But there's a lot of work for all of us to do, and we need to make clear in every conversation and every dialogue that there are people being sometimes excluded from these conversations and need to be at the table, if not leading the dialogue in many ways. So I really appreciate that. And it'd be great to take a look.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. I think that it's had a lot of nuance and a lot of information that people probably don't know on a regular basis. So hopefully people will learn a lot when they listen or watch. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.